This is Ben Goertzel here. I'm sitting at home in Hong Kong. I've just returned here from Shanghai, where I gave a talk at a conference on consciousness, science, technology, and society. It was a fun talk, pretty different in topic from the usual artificial general intelligence fare that I tend to deliver. But I didn't get a really good video of the talk, so now that I'm home, I decided just to record the talk again, so I'd have something to upload. It's after midnight. It's the witching hour, which is the right time to talk about strange things. The talk is called Consciousness and Psi in Biological and Artificial Systems, a Euryphysical model. So this is some wild ass shit. It's some mad scientist stuff, but I think that's not a bad thing. So this is Gottfried Leibniz. Leibniz was one of my heroes in my teenage years when I first discovered his philosophical writings, which are at least as interesting as his mathematical ones. And one thing I loved about Leibniz, as with many of the other great thinkers of his era hundreds of years ago, was that he was just thinking out of his own mind, out of his own heart and soul, whatever crazy shit came to him. You know, he wasn't trying to publish papers in refereed journals. He was trying to please the people who were paying him, but often they didn't really understand what he was talking about. Back then, before science became professional, it seemed more accepted just to follow your own strange intellectual vision wherever it led. So I make an effort to keep on doing that. You know, in much of my AI work, what I'm doing is quite practical, aimed at making robots do things, analyzing biology data. It's, you know, hardcore concrete stuff. But all of this hardcore concrete work, the stuff that really functions, originally began as wild as shit, as crazy ideas where you can't tell if they're going to come to anything or not. So in that vein of wild ass shit, I'm going to start now and tell you about some math tools for modeling conscious experience. The first point I want to suggest is that reflective consciousness of consciousness of consciousness of consciousness can be modeled as non-foundational recursion. And I published a paper on this in the Journal of Machine Consciousness, the dear departed Journal of Machine Consciousness. It's not published anymore, though we're hoping to bring it back. Non-foundational recursion refers to bottomless recursion. You know, a set A that contains itself as an element. A set A that contains B and contains itself as an element. So in old-fashioned set theory, you couldn't do this. It violates the axiom of foundation. Bertrand Russell long ago thought of what we now call the Russell paradox. You know, if you have a town in which the barber shaves everyone who doesn't shave himself, who shaves the barber. Because of these paradoxes regarding sets, like the set of all sets that don't contain themselves as an element, because of these paradoxes, Russell and Whitehead introduced the theory of types, which eliminated the possibility of sets containing themselves as elements. But more recently, Paul Axel and other set theorists have reintroduced these. So we have new axioms like the anti-foundation axiom, which let you introduce sets that contain themselves as elements. So this lets you formally model cool stuff like consciousness is consciousness of consciousness, which is really the experience we have. These non-foundational sets are described in an excellent book that I really loved back in the 1980s called The Liar by Barwise and Etchemendy. I strongly recommend it. In my paper in Journal of Machine Consciousness, I review some ideas like this. You can model reflective consciousness as I'm reflectively conscious of some entity X if I have in my mind the content saying that I am reflectively conscious of the entity X, and this correlates with X being a pattern in me. So it's not just consciousness is consciousness of consciousness, it's consciousness of something is consciousness of something being a pattern in us, and of our consciousness of something being a pattern in us, and of our consciousness of something being a pattern in us, and so forth. So it's a recursive reflexive pattern. Model is a non-foundational set. So it's a pattern that contains itself inside itself. It's recursive patterns all the way down. You can also model free will this way. You can model I will X as, have in my mind the content that I will X, and this will implies that I will do X. So it's not just consciousness that you'll do X, it's consciousness that you're willing that you'll do X, and consciousness that you willing that you'll do X is what's causing you to do X, and so on, all the way down. So you experience your acts of will as causal, and this experience of the act of will as causal is the act of will, and it's a recursive, non-foundational experience. Self is the same way. What does it mean that X is part of myself? It means I have the content that X is a part of myself correlates with X being a pattern in me over time. So myself is the recognition that myself is a pattern in myself, and that this is a part of myself. And this isn't just a bunch of crazy sounding nonsense. You can formalize it in mathematics using the anti-foundation axiom. One interesting conclusion you come to here is that, self is to long-term memory roughly as reflective consciousness is to short-term memory. And this pops right out of the math I just showed you. Look up the paper in Journal of Machine Consciousness. We can go a little further here if we want to model uncertain aspects of consciousness. Well, we can put probability distributions on non-foundational sets, but these are infinite order probability distributions, and you can look up, again, the paper I posted online. I delivered that at a conference in China like 9 years ago. A probability distribution is a set of probabilities assigned to events. A second order probability distribution is a probability distribution over probability distributions. It assigns a probability to each distribution. A third order probability distribution assigns a probability to each second order probability distribution. Now, an infinite order probability distribution assigns a probability to each infinite order probability distribution. It's infinite order probability distributions all the way down. This lets you put probability distributions on reflective consciousness, on will, on self, on all these funky things you can model using non-foundational sets. The next funky mathematical tool I want to talk about is hypercomputation, computing beyond the Turing machine. And there's some cool papers on this, not written by me. You can look up infinite time Turing machines. Zeno machines. So what's a Zeno machine? Well, Zeno's paradox. How can an object ever get anywhere? Because it's got to get halfway there, 3/4 of the way there, 7/8 of the way there, and so forth. Well, a Zeno machine, it does one computation after half a second, another one after 3/4 of a second, another one after 7/8 of a second, another one after 15/16 of a second. As the 1 second mark approaches, it does each computation faster and faster than the previous one. That's a Zeno machine. A perfectly valid mathematical entity, although whether we could build it in this physical universe is a different question. So hypercomputation, it's an interesting thing. You can use hypercomputation to model experience of certain kinds of possible minds. Whether these are minds we can have in this physical universe, again, is another question. I mean, it's possible that our brains have access to hypercomputable entities, and it's possible that our intuitions can judge these hypercomputable entities as being simpler than some computable entities. If so, a hypercomputable model of our experience could be the preferred model according to Occam's razor. I mean, it's a weird idea, but there's nothing logically ill-founded about it. So I wrote a paper which I recently submitted for publication together with my wife and her thesis advisor on the question, can human-level AI possibly require hypercomputing? Like, might it be that to make an AI that can really think, the AI needs to somehow be able to access hypercomputing? I mean, that might be the case if the human brain accesses hypercomputing. So to explore this, in the paper I go fairly deep. I start asking, what is science? Science is an activity that a bunch of people enter into together, and it's an activity people enter into together via language. So we communicate about science using language. Language being a collection of, finite utterances in words over a finite alphabet. And science has to do with finite data sets. All the scientific data ever gathered is a certain finite bit set. So, how could science, which is finite words and sentences being communicated about finite data sets, how could science ever have anything to do with hypercomputational entities that are too big to be computed by Turing machines? Well, it's not unthinkable that it could be. If the members of the scientific community rated some hypercomputable entities as simpler than some computable entities, then a hypercomputable explanation, say a Xeno machine program, could be considered a simpler explanation of some finite data set than computable explanations. Now, how could we communicate that to each other? Like, how could I tell you that the best way to explain some data set we saw was some Xeno machine program that can't be finitely described or can't be run on any finite Turing machine? Well, I mean, how the Buddha communicated his teaching to his disciples. He handed them a flower. I mean, if both of us know through some hypercomputable connection that we both have access to some hypercomputable entities, we can then refer to them in our discussion with each other. We can point to them with our finite language. We can point to a hypercomputable entity and say maybe that's the best explanation of this finite data set, even if we can't explicitly write out that hypercomputable entity in language. And why is this relevant? Well, it may have something to do with consciousness. What if consciousness is hypercomputable? What if you and I both know that we have consciousness? Then I can say consciousness. You recognize what I mean when I say consciousness. We're both pointing to some hypercomputable entity, but we can't ever summarize that hypercomputable entity in the finite productions of language. This is strange, but it's not scientifically or mathematically senseless. And furthermore, it doesn't imply that a digital computer program couldn't be conscious in the same way that human beings are. It would just imply that a digital computer program, in as much as we are describing it in a programming language or a natural language or in a finite set of data points, is only part of what's going on with that digital computation process. It could be that digital computer programs are somehow associated with hypercomputable entities and that human brains are. That's not an irrational hypothesis, although it's a tricky one and eludes our current modes of scientific data collection and linguistic communication. So I'll put this paper online soon. Actually, I think I already did. You can search for Ben Goertzel, Ray Tinglian. Could human-level AI require hypercomputation? And basically the answer is yes, but we could never prove it to someone who had a simplicity model in their mind in which hypercomputation was always more complex than finite computation. If it were the case that human-level AI required hypercomputing, you can only demonstrate it to minds that rated some hypercomputable entities as simpler than relevant computable entities. Again, that's hairy stuff. Look up the paper. I'm just trying to give a flavor here. So another way to say what I just said, entities with access to hypercomputation oracles, you could communicate about these oracles using computable entities as symbolism. And symbolism may be a more important thing than we commonly recognize, a point I'll come to a little later in this wild-ass ramble. Let me shift gears now and talk about something perhaps even wackier, psychic phenomena. So I edited a book a few years ago called The Evidence for Psi, together with Damien Broderick, and another excellent edited volume on the topic has come out more recently, Extrasensory Perception by Ed May and Sonali Marwaha. Both of these books gather scientific evidence that psychic powers, ESP, precognition, telekinesis, can exist. And I think they do exist. I think they're slippery, screwy phenomena with lots of weird aspects, but real nonetheless. And I don't know how or why they work. I think my friend Rupert Sheldrake's somewhat vague, slippery concept of morphic resonance may help explain them, although I think the concept needs a lot of refinement. The way I look at morphic resonance, which is a little bit different than Sheldrake's formulation, what it means is that when two things, X and Y, share some patterns, they're surprisingly likely to share more patterns. And what that means is if you look at the set of all pairs of entities, and you make a histogram of the pairwise similarities of each pair of entities, that histogram will be very steep in the middle. It means that there's more things that share a real lot of patterns than you would expect otherwise. So that's one version of morphic resonance, and I've made some blog posts on my blog, The Multiverse According to Ben. If you search for morphic resonance in my blog, you'll find them. And I also mentioned that in a blog called Euryphysics, which I'll discuss a little later. It's interesting that Sheldrake's morphic resonance is very similar to what Lee Smolin, the mainstream physicist, called the precedence principle in quantum mechanics. And take a look for Smolin's paper, Precedence and Freedom in Quantum Mechanics. In essence, what he proposes there is that once an event has occurred a real lot of times, it's very likely to occur again. And then he speculates if an event has occurred just a few times, its odds of occurring again has to do with the algorithmic information of the event, with how simple it is. But that, in essence, comes down to morphic resonance, because algorithmic information is small if there's a lot of pattern in something. So it all comes down to what the philosopher Charles Peirce, a huge influence on me, called the tendency to take habits. Once there's a habit there, the habit is likely to continue. Where there's some pattern, there's likely to be more pattern. Now, morphic resonance is a very general, almost philosophical concept. It doesn't work that reliably or that universally, or the world would be a lot weirder even than it is. But we can see some windows in nature and in the human body and brain where morphic resonance might have a chance to pop up and play a substantial role. So this has to do with quantum biology. There's a lot of recent evidence that protein molecules are often in critical states. It might be in states of weak quantum coherence. Now, this might be a place where weird quantum phenomena or phenomena extending current quantum physics, perhaps extending it using some form of morphic resonance, could influence how the brain works. And here's a couple quite interesting papers in this regard, looking at proteins as quantum critical systems and protein folding as quantum transitions between conformational states. Now these papers are just hinting at how quantum phenomena might influence proteins, but they're very interesting hints. And I think John Joe McFadden has been writing a bit less rigorously, but very evocatively about this stuff for quite some time. So think about it. A few thousand proteins acting in a coordinated way can influence a neuron to fire. So if proteins are weakly quantum coherent, proteins can influence neurons to fire. Pretty interesting. There's also evidence here and there that water megamolecules in the brain might be in a state of weak quantum coherence. Again, a way that some sort of quantum-related phenomena could influence neurodynamics. Water is just a lot more complicated than anyone realizes. We don't understand it well. There are nuclear quantum effects in water. It's possible that weird, weak quantum coherence effects in water megamolecules could be responsible for the times that homeopathic remedies seem to work. How could a tiny little bit of stuff going in your body actually affect its state? Well, if that tiny little bit of stuff is propagating quantum chaotically through weakly coherent water megamolecules, who knows? It's not proven, but it's not scientifically absurd. We know that bird brains use quantum coherence in proteins and in wet molecules for navigation. Again, that's a very special part of the bird's brain. It's an isolated phenomenon, but it does show that macroscopic quantum coherence in organic molecules can have impacts on real organisms. Now, it doesn't seem to me that quantum theory in its current form can explain psychic phenomena. I mean, quantum theory might explain how the brain could in some sense be in a weak quantum coherent state, but I can't see how quantum theory could explain ESP, like me reading something in the mind of someone across the room or 1,000 miles away. I mean, from everything I can understand, there's just too much decoherence between my head and some faraway person's head. So, I mean, it's true that we don't fully have a solution of the Schrodinger equation, let alone the standard model for a big system like a bunch of people in a house. But from everything we can tell, you're just not going to keep even weak coherence going over big macroscopic classical-ish systems like people walking around in a house or something, let alone people 1,000 miles away from each other. It seems like you're going to need some extension to the rules of quantum mechanics to explain psychic phenomena, and maybe morphic resonance has something to do with it. I mean, here we have an interesting paper explaining how quantum mechanics might play a role in the brain using quantum superpositions in phosphate ions, but still, how are these neural qubits, how are these phosphate ions correlating between my brain and a distant brain? That requires something else, I think, and I published a paper on my website called Morphic Pilot Theory, exploring that a while ago, and I wrote more about that in my Euryphysics blog that I'll tell you about in a moment. How can we explore this scientifically? Well, I think we need to push the study of psi beyond psychology. It can't just be parapsychology. I mean, we've got to look in the brains of animals carrying out psi phenomena. We've got to look at the DNA of people who are good at psi. I mean, if you find an animal carrying out psychic phenomena and you can instrument that animal with, electrodes and other imaging equipment to find what part of the animal's brain or body is differentially acting when the animal is carrying out ESP precognition or whatever it's doing, then you can poke in that part of the animal's body and you can try to figure out what's the biophysics there. And from seeing the biophysics in the part of the animal's body that's helping it do psi, then you can see what's the physics underlying that biophysics. Is it really plain vanilla quantum mechanics, or is there something strange going on underlying the quantum mechanics? Maybe some of the random noise in quantum mechanics is not really random noise, but maybe it involves correlations that current quantum theory doesn't understand. I mean, morphic resonance, as I propose it, involves things being more correlated than you would expect at random. So perhaps the quantum noise actually has a different sort of non-local correlations than quantum theory predicts. Perhaps when two quantum noisy events happen to correlate, when some quantum noise event in my brain and some quantum noise event in a far-off brain happen to correlate, so there's some emergent between them, maybe that makes it more likely that more emergent pattern pops up between them. That's what morphic resonance would suggest. Maybe morphic resonance is a kind of biasing of what we think of now as quantum noise. I mean, I've articulated that hypothesis. Lee Smolin's speculations would imply that hypothesis. This could provide some basis for explaining some psi phenomena. We need a lot more work to see for sure. Here's an interesting paper on precognition among planarian worms. Basically, you put a bunch of planarian worms in a tank and you shock them. Not very nice, but in the interest of science. But some of the worms wiggle around before the shock comes. They seem to precognize. Well, that's interesting. Now, what if we stuck wires in the planarian worms and saw what parts of their little planarian brains are differentially active for those worms that precognize? Maybe that would give us some clue to investigate the biophysics of precognitive planarian worms, and maybe that would give us some clue to the tweaks to quantum mechanics we need to do to explain psi phenomena. Okay, let's get a little crazier. Psi is not the end of it. There's an excellent book published recently called Surviving Death by Leslie Kane. There's quite substantial, though complex and confusing evidence that survival after death phenomena exist. Things in the vein of reincarnation, ghosts, mediumistic seances. Another book I'd very strongly recommend is called Immortal Remains by Stephen Browder, a philosopher who was the head of philosophy at University of Maryland, Baltimore County for a while. Seems these things happen. If you really look at the evidence, you can't explain it away. It's not fraud. It's not people being naive or crazy. There's weird shit going on. We don't know what it is. The standard stories of traditional religions certainly can't be accurate, but explaining it all away in the name of some naive materialism is neither warranted. And I've written a review of this book. It'll appear shortly in the Journal of Scientific Exploration, called The Compelling, Confusing Evidence for an Afterlife. I mean, when these kids are born knowing facts in detail about the life of someone else who died, along with the feeling that they are that person, I mean, there's something going on there. It's surely not exactly like the Tibetan Buddhists say, but I mean, that's something. And we got to understand what it is. That's important. It tells us something about this universe. I mean, David Hansen, my beloved colleague, made a robot, Philip K. Dick. If we understood what's going on with all these reincarnation-like phenomena, maybe we could pull Philip K. Dick's mind out from whatever other dimensions it's persisting in and reincarnate Phil Dick in the Philip K. Dick robot. I mean, reincarnation machines sounds way out there, but I mean, 500 years ago, spacecraft and the internet seemed way out there, so we're not very good at predicting what's going to be just routine and boring a few hundred years in the future, or sometimes even a few dozen years in the future. And that brings me to my philosophical and perhaps in the future scientific concept of the Eurycosm. So I made up the word Euryphysics because metaphysics basically sounded too out there and too scientific. I mean, metaphysical reality is outside of the world. But what does that even mean? I mean, if the reality is outside of this physical space-time continuum, okay, but then it's just a broader world. It's a broader reality. It's not outside of the world. It's not beyond the world. It's just a bigger world. So Eury is a prefix meaning wide. The Eurycosm is the wider world. Our physical world is part of it. Now, that's not even such a weird idea now. Like string theory thinks we're stuck inside a 26-dimensional world. Our 4-dimensional space-time continuum is just a little bit of this 26-dimensional containing space. Now, the difference is the wider space that I conjecture, the Eurycosm, I'm conjecturing this space is mind-like in some ways, not just physics-like. It's not like higher dimensional rigid bodies moving around. It's not just higher dimensional vibrating strings. It's mind patterns, among probably a lot of other stuff we can't currently understand. We can call it higher dimensions, sort of metaphorically. It may not really be dimensions. It's obviously a topological space, mathematically. Some things can be nearer or further within it. The structure of this space is something we need to probe. We can probe it in some ways with meditation, with psychedelics, with mathematical and conceptual theory, but we need to probe it way better than we've done so far. And my thoughts on this are in a blog I started called Euryphysics, which has a bunch of entries, and near the top of that page there's a link to a PDF, which is mostly the same as the blog post, a little less personal chatty version, or the slightly more formal PDF version, and a version of that PDF will appear in a special issue of the Journal of Non-Locality, which I'm editing with Leon Sidorov. That issue of the Journal of Non-Locality is on the topic of psi and the non-local mind. Contains a number of people's speculative thinking on the topic. This paper on Euryphysics is my own contribution. So, if there is a higher dimensional containing space in which our 4-dimensional space-time continuum is just a subset, this may tell us something about psi phenomena. Now, the idea that psi phenomena might be explained by a higher dimensional universe is not new. I mean, it's almost obvious once you know about higher dimensions, right? Like if me and someone around the world are 10,000 miles away on this planet, but 1 millimeter away in the 4th dimension, then it makes it quite simple how we could communicate with each other. I mean, just as 2 points could be very far away on this piece of paper, but very close in the 3rd dimension. I mean, the problem with that naive idea that psi is communicating through higher dimensions is it kind of explains too much. I mean, if it were that simple, then why why aren't we all just connected together all the time in an explicit and practical way? So there's got to be some specific logic to these higher dimensions, and I think Morphic Resonance is probably part of that. I discussed this and some other ideas in the Euryphysics blog. Another interesting possibility is the Eurycosm maybe modeled as hypercomputational. So, I mean, if our 4D space-time continuum is effectively modelable via Turing computable models, which it seems to be. I mean, all known theories of physics, from quantum mechanics, nuclear physics, Einstein's general relativity theory, these are all, in essence, Turing computable. Quantum theory cannot compute any functions except those that are Turing computable. A quantum computer can do some things much faster, exponentially faster in the average case than a classical Turing machine, but it can't compute any non-Turing computable functions. Neither can you with general relativity. Seems like the evidence points in the direction that our physical universe may be Turing computable, but maybe the wider containing space is hypercomputable, and maybe our minds touch that somehow, maybe using some morphic resonance embedded in quantum noise, which isn't all noisy. Perhaps this morphic resonant quantum quasi noise popping up in our brains from time to time due to weak quantum coherence phenomena, perhaps this is our way of accessing a hypercomputational oracle. Stranger things have been known on God's green earth. Morphic resonance pervading our brains in a way that goes beyond Turing computation. Think about reincarnation and apparent survival after death. One way to think about that is that each of us as an individual may have an existence in this space-time continuum and an existence outside this space-time continuum, elsewhere in the Eurycosm. The part of me that's not in this space-time continuum has its own existence in that higher dimensional containing space and may morphically resonate or otherwise complexly interact with the part of me that's in this space-time continuum. How this interaction works, we don't know. It seems pretty weird and mercurial, and sometimes it exists and sometimes it doesn't from our perspective here in this space-time. But these phenomena, reincarnation, survival in some sense of the mind beyond the death of the body, these phenomena exist. We need to account for them somehow. Don't get me wrong, I don't believe that like after our body dies we frolic in heaven like in the Jehovah's Witnesses brochures you get, where after you die you're there with your family like romping on the green fields and sipping lemonade. I mean, no one pops up in a seance or reincarnated in a new body and says, hey, it was awesome up there in the afterlife, like I was playing golf with Richard Nixon and like flying around, and wow, it's really awesome to be able to, prove theorems about inaccessible cardinals using the hypercomputers we have available up there. No one comes back from the dead and reports their awesome life in the afterlife. The idea that there's some afterlife similar to this world seems to be a fiction born of wishful thinking, but the idea that our mind patterns in some sense exist beyond this 4D space-time continuum and can pop up in this 4D space-time continuum spatially or temporally separated from the physical body with which our minds are primarily associated. I mean, that seems real. Something is going on there. Another fascinating aspect of all this is if you do have morphic resonance and a Eurycosm full of patterns, that implies symbols may actually have real power, because a symbol is something that shares patterns with a lot of other things. So if you have morphic resonance sending some influence between one instance of a pattern and another instance of that pattern, then a symbol like, say, the hexagrams in the I Ching, or the 9-dimensional machine elves that some of us have seen while under the influence of DMT and other substances. These symbols, which resonate and overlap with so many specific instances, morphic resonance would suggest they could have some real resonant power. The Eurycosm may contain many patterns, and it may contain patterns that correspond to powerful symbols in our world, so that when we create something manifesting a certain symbolic pattern, it resonates with the instance of that symbolic pattern in the Eurycosm, which then resonates back to other instances of that symbolic pattern in our universe. That might have something to do with the phenomenon that the great quantum physicist Eugene Wigner noted in his classic paper, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. Now, why is the same math so persistent all across this universe? It's weird. Now, maybe it's just that math is good, math is powerful, or maybe there's something spookier going on, where once a certain mathematical symmetry takes hold and is persistent throughout a large swath of the universe, morphic resonance phenomena, in other words, the tendency to take habits, the tendency that once a pattern is there, it's especially more likely to pop up somewhere else. Maybe that helps explain why the same mathematical phenomena are so pervasive in this universe we're in. And, if you look, there's endless other examples of how the same simple mathematical patterns pop up over and over and over again. The mandalas of ancient times look a lot, in some cases, like the multiplication table of the octonion division algebra. And these same algebras, abstract algebras, pop up all over the place. My friend Tony Smith had some fun and wacky web pages exploring his theories of physics and exploring their relation with voodoo, with art, with music, and all sorts of other stuff. There's a lot of wild speculation here. I pursued some of it in a paper some years ago called Mirror Neurons, Mirror Houses, and the Algebraic Structure of the Self. Looking there at octonion mirror houses, what happens when you're inside a dodecahedral or tetrahedral mirror house, how do the algebras there relate to the algebras in physics? How do the algebras there relate to the algebras of conscious self-reflection inside the human mind, to these hyperset structures in the mind that I talked about at the beginning of this ramble? So these are ideas I thought about with Tony Smith, Kent Palmer, and Oner in the late 1990s. I'm not sure how much of it is just funky speculative nonsense, how much has any real meaning. There's a lot of other even weirder thoughts by other people out there exploring archetypal sacred geometries and their meaning for the mind. And I'll tell you, if you stare at these pictures in certain altered states of consciousness, you will become convinced they're manifesting, fundamental symmetries and processes of the mind and universe, and then these things pop up in models of theoretical physics in all sorts of surprising ways. So there's a lot of spooky symbolism power out there. There's also potentially a tie-in with non-dual states of consciousness. If you look at, for example, the Vedantic hierarchy, Indian and Chinese theories of higher states of consciousness. The states of consciousness you can get into on psychedelics or in a more lasting way by meditation and wisdom traditions, or that some people just pop into all of a sudden in a sudden enlightenment. Many of these states of consciousness appear to involve your own individual mind getting simpler and simpler as you let go of attachments and untie mental knots, but your mind becoming more and more coupled with a broader universe, with aspects that ordinary people don't even see. It may be that non-dual states of consciousness, enlightened states of consciousness, involve more and more resonance with aspects of the universe beyond our space-time continuum. These ideas may be able to help us address what Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness as well. Like how does the experience of being conscious, phenomenal consciousness, relate to the patterns in the brain related to consciousness? I mean, I suggested already that the experience of consciousness may be hypercomputational in some sense. It's interesting that there's a structural similarity between, sets containing themselves as elements or each other as elements, like X contains Y, Y contains X, in some non-foundational recursion. And on the other hand, simple feedback loops of X affects Y, Y affects X. The same graphs are used to denote the two of them. Maybe that's pointing at something more significant. Maybe the structural similarity between anti-foundational containment, as we have in consciousness is consciousness of consciousness and so forth. The structural relation between that and nonlinear feedback dynamics, as you have in recurrent neural networks and in complex dynamical AI systems like the OpenCog system I'm working on. Maybe the connection between these two kinds of circularity is actually a morphic resonance. Maybe the morphic resonance between feedback loops in nonlinear dynamical systems in the physical universe and loops of paradoxical non-foundational containment associated with reflexive consciousness in the Eurycosm. Maybe this morphic resonance is what gives qualia their association with structures in the physical universe. Yeah, that's a mouthful. It's a weird idea. You've got to progress pretty far in the Eurycosmic direction to think that makes sense. On the other hand, I mean, how much progress are more conventional perspectives really making at understanding the hard problem of consciousness? I've alluded a bit to quantum theory and how it might explain consciousness and connect to hypercomputation and so forth. I want to introduce another wrinkle here. So the Eurycosm doesn't have to be consistent. I mean, that's partly to do with hypercomputing. Gödel's theorem gives certain limitations on any formal system that's powerful, consistent, and complete. Some people think Gödel's theorem therefore places limitations on the human mind. I don't think so, because the human mind is not very consistent, but the Eurycosm, the Browder containing space beyond our 4D space-time continuum, may be even more wildly inconsistent. How can we model this kind of inconsistency? Well, there's an interesting paper, the possibility of using complex values in fuzzy logic for representing inconsistencies. Now, what's that about? Well, if you have a non-dual space where you can have both X and not X being true, contradictions are real, then how do we model that mathematically? Well, if we model not using 1 minus true as 1 and as times, X and not X is true, comes out to X times 1 minus X equals 1. But wait a minute. Solution to that is a complex number with a I times square root of 3. So, we start with paradox, we get to complex number truth values. But complex number truth values lead you straight to quantum theory, either by the normal path with amplitudes or by an interesting path with saw Yusef's theory of quantum mechanics as exotic probability. So we get from paradox to complex truth values to quantum mechanics. But remember, the Eurycosm involves these non-foundational sets, like consciousness, which is consciousness of consciousness. To put uncertainty on these non-foundational sets, you want infinite order probability distributions. So, in the end, propositions about the Eurycosm should be modeled using complex valued infinite order probability distributions, a branch of math that really hasn't been studied much so far. Let's get back to computers now. I'm supposed to be talking about AI. I'm an AI researcher, right? So I've talked about quantum mechanics and consciousness and morphic resonance and the brain. So all this weird Eurycosmic quantum and trans quantum dynamics may interface the brain through water megamolecules or quantum criticality in proteins. How does that help a digital computer? How would that help an OpenCog system to have human-like consciousness? Well, turns out there's arguments that digital computers may be in some sense quantum too. Quantum logic, the algebra of quantum logic, might be the right way to describe some classical systems from the point of view of some observers. And of course, in quantum mechanics, as Rovelli has pointed out with the relational interpretation, I mean, all that matters is what happens from the point of view of some observer. There is no objective quantum reality apart from any observer. Interesting paper by a guy named Alexei Greenbaum. What he argues there is if you have a system S with much greater algorithmic information than the observer O should model S's states using quantum theory. On the other hand, if S and O have around the same algorithmic information, then O should model S's states in a more classical way. Now that's a crude way of putting it, but I think it's getting it at something. I mean, there's multiple ways that you can be quantum. So the basic idea is quantum logic is what an observer should use to model something they cannot, in principle, know. Now, in the most common case, the reason I, as an observer, can't, in principle, know something is because it's so little that to know it, I have to knock it around with my measuring instrument. But it's also possible for something to be unknowable to me because it's so big and so complex, I can't fit it inside my own mind. No matter what the reason, if I can't know it, I should model it using quantum logic. Whether I can't know it because it's too little or because it's too algorithmically information bearing. And what that suggests is that a really huge digital computer, massively more complex than my brain, from my own observational point of view, its states should be modeled as a quantum system. On the other hand, all that matters in quantum mechanics is some observer's point of view. There's no such thing as an objective system outside of someone's point of view. Diederik Eyerts at the Free University of Brussels and Lian Gabora have also published a bunch of interesting things on this topic. And Atmanspacher, I'll give some links to that in the Euryphysics and some of my other blog posts. So quantum algebra modeling classical phenomena is an interesting area of scientific inquiry. If you put it together with the possible role of quantum theory in modeling consciousness, the possible role of quantum theory as an avenue for Eurycosmic morphic resonance to come in and poke our universe. In this context, the potential quantumness of digital computers is interesting. Quantum theory may be the logic an observer must apply to model things it in principle can observe, whether the unobservability is due to being too small or too big, and this may give the route by which quantum theory and quantum phenomena and maybe some post-quantum phenomena pervade the really big digital computer AIs we will create in the future. So can digital computers be conscious? Can they be psychic? Well, we don't know, but maybe. Maybe they can be with respect to a certain observer if they're sufficiently more complex than that observer. So you can see why I became an AI guy and a philosopher and a mathematician, even a bit of a musician, but not a visual artist. I hate making diagrams. But anyway, I made one here. We've got the physical universe, we've got the Eurycosm, we've got the part of a person in this universe and the part of a person in the Eurycosm, and part of a robot in the Eurycosm also. And we've got connections in the Eurycosm that may come back and influence things in the physical universe, and we have morphic resonance between similar structures in the Eurycosm and in the physical universe, even if those similar structures also have differences, like the differences between nonlinear feedback loops in recurrent neural networks or open cog systems and non-foundational recurrences involved with consciousness in the hypercomputational Eurycosm. And psychic powers may involve this type of resonant correlation between physical universe entities and their Eurycosmic correlates. So this is weird shit. I promised you some weird shit. But I do think in a sense it's scientific. But to really explore this scientifically, we may need to expand our notion of science, but that's not so far out there. Science has expanded its scope many, many times so far. When I think of a second-person science, is a way of investigating some of these phenomena at the border between the objective and the subjective, by directly connecting the brains of multiple scientists. So, think about how science works. The key of it is you've got a community of people, and we all agree on certain data as being valid and worthy of exploration, and then we work together to find mutually agreeable explanations of that data. The issue with applying science to experiential consciousness is it's not shared data. I have mine, and I can't share it with others in a repeatable and compelling way. We can have subjective second-person experiences. I've shared deep, meaningful, conscious moments with my children, with lovers, with friends, but this sharing of conscious experience is not repeatable enough to be part of the realm of science. But what if we could wire our brains into each other's brains? What if I could wire my brain into an open cog system running on my laptop? Then we could have repeatable second-person experience. Then my state of consciousness could become direct experience to someone who made a big wire into my head, or hopefully some sort of wireless connection that doesn't involve cutting my head open. Now, suppose I had connected my brain to some other guy's brain so we could feel each other's conscious experience. A third guy could then tap into that wire and he could feel us feeling each other's experience. There's going to be complexities, but the bottom line is direct brain-to-brain interfacing, brain-to-computer interfacing, that can enable states of consciousness, conscious experiences to become real, direct, scientific data, but a different kind than we have now. Not tables of numbers, but experiences of each other that we can tap into. And, we can then tweak our brains and tweak the computer systems and bioengineered systems that we're interfacing with, and not only observe their physical reaction, but sense their reaction with our direct conscious experience as we manipulate them. We can take our AI program, we can insert a quantum processing unit into the computer on which the AI program is running, and by wiring our brain into that computer, we can then feel the extent to which that computer's consciousness was affected by the addition of the quantum processing unit. I mean, that's interesting. It's a way to bring some of these wacky ideas into the domain of science. If indeed human brains and or digital computers have access to hyper-computable oracles, even if we can't write them down on a piece of paper, if I wire my brain into your brain or into a computer's memory and registers, we can have a shared experience of accessing the same hypercomputable oracle and know that we're having that shared experience. Very interesting. So that's it for now. Actually, there's a lot more where that came from, but I'm getting tired now. I'm trying to work out more math along these lines using some graph theory models to explore weak quantum coherence and morphic resonance and so forth, and trying to come up with concrete models of various psi phenomena based on these ideas. I mean, this is stuff I just think about occasionally in evenings and weekends, basically, since building thinking machines, which is my day job, is already incredibly intensive and difficult and takes more than 100% of my mind. And then in addition to building a thinking machine, or trying with the OpenCog project, and thinking about weird stuff like this, I have to do a whole bunch of practical projects to keep money coming in to fund the OpenCog team. So I'm pretty busy with a lot of things, but yet these crazy ideas keep attracting me because, the reason I got into AI in the first place is wanting to understand the mind. And all these thoughts, these are part of the quest to understand the mind and understand the world and how the mind builds the world and the world builds the mind. I don't think we need to understand all this weird shit in order to build an AI. I think you can engineer an AI using a meaningful cognitive architecture and powerful learning algorithms implemented on powerful computers. And then if there is a connection between the AI mind and some other realm of consciousness, some Eurycosmic mind domain, this may just happen the way it just happens when a baby is born and its brain matures and grows up. So I'm not sure you need to understand this to build a mind, but you may need to understand this to really understand how that mind is working in every respect once it's up and running. You could view my perspective on this as a kind of dualism, in that I'm looking at there as being an aspect to the mind going beyond the brain, and an aspect perhaps to a digital computer's AI mind going beyond what's explicitly in that digital computer. But I don't really see it as dualism, because I see the Eurycosmic containing space as non-dual. So if there's a dualism, it's a dualism between the non-dual world and the portion of the non-dual world that splits itself off and concretizes itself and makes itself seem separate. Anyway, this gets more and more philosophical and hard to communicate about. I'm aware I have, in this replication of my lecture from the Consciousness, Science, Technology, and Society conference, in this replication of my lecture, I've done just what I did in the actual lecture there, and I went through a whole bunch of weird concepts, giving each one much less time than it deserves, and probably confusing the fuck out of anyone who's listening. On the other hand, these are things I'm thinking about. I think they're important topics, and I'm eager to spread these lines of thinking among other interested people, in the hope that some of these weird ideas may spark some other weird idea in someone else's mind, because these are big questions. They're too big for any of us to resolve on our own. We've got to think through these things together. This world we're living in, this 4D space-time continuum, it's not as simple as the traditional scientific materialist view would have you think. On the other hand, the traditional religions don't quite get it right either. I mean, they have a lot of insight, but there's a lot of superstition mixed up there. We don't understand what we are. We don't understand what this world is. Building thinking machines smarter than us may well be the best way to understand who we are and what this world is, because a machine smarter than us will be able to understand a lot of things that we can't now understand. On the other hand, I can't resist trying to understand the whole thing better and better right now myself anyway, because I don't have that superhuman thinking machine to ask yet. And it may be that to get the superhuman thinking machines fully right in all their aspects, we need to understand the mind and the world better. I don't know. Anyway, thanks for listening.